Welcome back to Fear Rest. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 deeply unsettling stories from the Blue Ridge Mountains. Tales of remote cabins, forgotten trails, and hollow roads, where people encountered something that still haunts them years later. These accounts come from those who ventured into the isolation of Appalachia and discovered they weren't as alone as they thought. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The cabin I inherited from my uncle sat about 40 minutes outside of Boone, North Carolina, up a dirt road that turned to gravel, then to just 2 tire ruts cutting through mountain laurel. Uncle Dennis had lived there for 36 years before the stroke took him. I'd visited maybe twice as a kid, remembered it being dark inside even during the day, all those trees pressing close. I was 32 when I finally drove up to deal with his things. It was late October, I remember, because the leaves were that burnt orange color they get right before they fall. My girlfriend at the time, Sarah, had offered to come with me, but I'd said no. Felt like something I should do alone. Looking back, I wonder if that was the dumbest decision I ever made, or if having her there would have just meant we both saw what I saw. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. 1-story, green metal roof, a porch that sagged on the left side. I parked my Tacoma next to Uncle Dennis's old F-150. Estate lawyer said I'd inherit that too, but the battery was dead and the inspection had expired 3 years ago. The key stuck in the front door lock. I had to jiggle it for a good minute before something clicked and the door swung inward. Inside smelled like old coffee and dust, and something else, something organic I couldn't quite place. Main room had a wood stove, a couch with a plaid blanket draped over it, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. One wall was entirely books, field guides, local history, some Louis L. paperbacks with cracked spines. I'd planned to spend the weekend sorting things, maybe take a few items back with me to Asheville, arrange for an estate sale company to handle the rest. I brought in my duffel bag and the cooler I'd packed, set them by the couch, checked my phone, 1 bar of service barely, that was fine. I told Sarah I'd call when I got there, but the cell signal was so weak I figured I'd just text her later. The first thing that felt off was the back door. It was standing open maybe 6 inches, just enough that I could see a slice of the woods beyond, afternoon light filtering through the trees at an angle that made everything look golden and somehow wrong at the same time. I walked over and pulled it shut, turned the deadbolt. The door was solid wood, painted dark green on the outside, and when I tested the handle it was locked tight, but I could have sworn Uncle Dennis was the type to keep things locked up. He'd been paranoid about bears getting in, always talking about them during those childhood visits. I told myself the estate lawyer had probably left it open during the final walkthrough, or maybe the house had settled and the latch didn't catch right anymore. Old houses do that. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through Uncle Dennis's things. Found a box of photographs under his bed, him as a younger man, probably in his 30s, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. She was pretty, dark-haired, smiling in that genuine way people did before everyone got self-conscious about pictures. I'd never heard of Uncle Dennis having a girlfriend, let alone someone he'd kept photos of. There were maybe a dozen pictures of her, then nothing, like she'd just vanished from his life. The light was fading when I heard the knocking. 3 deliberate taps on the back door, not loud, not soft, measured. I was in the kitchen area heating up a can of soup on the electric hot plate, and I just froze with the spoon in my hand. For a second I thought maybe a branch had fallen against the door, but the taps had been too evenly spaced, too intentional. I walked over and looked out the small window set into the door. Couldn't see anyone. Just trees and the thick undergrowth of mountain laurel, and the light going all purple and dim the way it does right before dark. "Hello?" I called through the door. Nothing. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door wide, stepped out onto the small concrete slab that served as a back step. The woods were quiet. Not peaceful quiet, that absence of sound quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I could see maybe 50 feet before the trees got too thick. No movement. No animals, no people, no wind moving the branches. My mouth had gone dry, like I'd swallowed sawdust. I stepped back inside and locked the door again, and this time I wedged one of the kitchen chairs under the handle. My soup had started to burn, so I took it off the hot plate and ate it anyway, standing at the counter, watching the back door the entire time. Night came on fast in the mountains. By 7 o'clock it was full dark outside, the kind of darkness you don't get in cities, where the absence of light feels like a physical presence. I hadn't brought a lantern, stupid, so I was relying on the few dim bulbs scattered throughout the cabin. Uncle Dennis hadn't believed in overhead lighting, apparently, just lamps and the glow from the wood stove if you got it going. I tried to read one of his books, some history of the Blue Ridge, but I kept losing my place. My eyes wanted to drift to the windows, to the squares of blackness where the glass reflected the lamplight back at me. I couldn't see out. Anything could be looking in. Around 9 I heard it, my own voice calling from outside. "Hey, anyone home?" It came from the direction of the front porch, and it sounded exactly like me. Same inflection, same tone I'd use if I was trying to get someone's attention without shouting too loud. I stood up from the couch fast enough that the book fell from my lap and hit the floor with a slap. "Hello," my voice called again. "I'm locked out." I did not walk to that door. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay exactly where I was, but my hand was already reaching for the deadbolt before my brain caught up. I stopped myself maybe 2 inches from turning it. "Who's there?" I managed to say. My voice, my real voice, came out hoarse. Silence. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, "It's me. Come on, man, it's cold out here." The casual way it said, "It's me," made my skin crawl. Like whatever was out there expected me to just open the door based on voice alone, expected that would be enough. I backed away from the door, pulled out my phone. No service now, not even one bar. My hands were shaking as I went around the cabin checking every window, every lock. The back door chair was still wedged tight. All the windows were latched. But I kept imagining hands pressing against the glass from outside, faces peering in. I didn't hear my voice again, but around midnight I heard footsteps on the porch. Not walking, just shifting weight. The old boards would creak in this specific rhythm, creak, pause, like someone was standing right outside the front door, rocking back and forth from heel to toe, testing their weight or waiting. I sat on the couch with Uncle Dennis's maglite in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, and I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just listened to those boards creak for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then they stopped. The silence after was worse than the sound. I must have dozed off around 3, still sitting upright, because I jerked awake to early light coming through the windows. Gray dawn light, the kind that makes everything look washed out and unreal. My neck hurt from the angle I'd been sleeping at. The knife was still in my hand. I stood up slowly, joints popping, and went to the front window, looked out at the porch. There was a boot print on the wooden boards right in front of the door, just one. The boards were dusty enough that the print showed up clear, a work boot, size 11 or 12 maybe, with that waffle tread pattern. But there were no other prints leading up to it, none leading away from it. Just that one print, directly in front of the door, like someone had materialized there, stood in that one spot all night, then vanished. I packed my duffel in under 5 minutes. Didn't care about the estate sale, didn't care about Uncle Dennis's things, didn't care about anything except getting to my truck. I kept the knife in my hand until I was in the cab with the doors locked and the engine running. As I backed out, I looked at the cabin one more time. The front door was standing open. I know I locked it. I know I checked it 3 times before I went to the couch. But it was open now, swinging slightly in the breeze that had picked up with the dawn, and I could see into the dark interior where something pale moved back from the doorway into the shadows. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have, didn't slow down until I hit pavement, and I didn't stop until I was back in Asheville. Called the estate lawyer that afternoon and told him to sell everything as is. I wasn't going back. He asked if something happened. I told him the cabin gave me bad vibes. That was 6 years ago. The cabin sold eventually, got bought by some developer who planned to flip it. But I checked the property records sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, and it's changed hands 4 times since then. No one keeps it longer than 8 months. I never did find out who the woman in those photographs was. But sometimes I wonder if Uncle Dennis spent 36 years in that cabin because he was running from something, or because he was keeping something locked in. Either way, I think about that boot print. I think about my own voice calling to me from outside, and I think about how whatever was out there knew exactly how to sound like me, which means it had been listening for a while. Story 2. My brother-in-law Keith bought 40 acres off Route 88 in Virginia, about an hour south of Roanoke, back in 2019. He paid almost nothing for it because the land had a reputation. People in the nearby town, Glade Springs, population maybe 800, They'd get quiet when you mentioned that particular hollow, but Keith didn't care about local superstition. He wanted somewhere to build a workshop, maybe put up a small house eventually, do the whole off-grid thing. I was visiting him and my sister that September, and Keith asked if I wanted to hike out to see the property. My sister, Jennifer, declined immediately, said she'd been out there once and that was enough. But I figured, why not? I'd taken the week off from my job at the insurance office in Richmond, and a hike sounded better than sitting around their rental house watching Jennifer organize her craft supplies. It was a Thursday. I remember because I'd been putting off calling my dentist about a follow-up appointment, and I kept thinking I'd do it Thursday, then Friday at the latest. Funny what details stick with you. We parked Keith's Jeep at the end of a Forest Service road and walked in from there. The trail, if you could call it, that was overgrown enough that we had to push through mountain laurel and brambles for the first quarter mile. Keith had been out there enough times that he knew the way, or claimed to. He kept pointing out landmarks: a fallen oak with a split trunk, a creek bed that was dry this time of year, a rock formation that looked vaguely like a face if you squinted. The property itself was in a hollow, this natural bowl in the mountains with steep ridges on three sides and only one easy way in or out. Dense woods, mostly poplar and oak, with enough underbrush that you couldn't see more than 30 or 40 feet in any direction. Keith had cleared a small area near the center, maybe 20 by 20 feet, and put up a tarp shelter with some camping gear underneath. "This is it," he said, gesturing around like he was showing me a mansion. "Peaceful, right?" It wasn't peaceful, that's the thing. The woods should have been full of sound, birds, insects, wind in the leaves, but it was muted somehow like we were in a bubble. I didn't mention it to Keith because he seemed excited, pointing out where he wanted to put the workshop, where the house would go, how he'd run solar panels along the ridgeline. We spent maybe an hour walking the property lines. Keith had marked the corners with orange surveyor's tape, though some of the markers had been torn down or moved. He mentioned that casually, said it was probably deer rubbing against the trees, but I noticed he didn't make eye contact when he said it. We ate lunch under the tarp shelter, sandwiches Jennifer had packed for us, and Keith pulled out his phone to show me the house plans he'd been working on. That's when I saw it. Between two trees, maybe 50 feet from where we were sitting, someone had strung up a length of thin wire. I wouldn't have noticed, except the sun hit it at just the right angle and it caught the light. The wire ran horizontally between the trees, about 6 feet off the ground, and hanging from it were small objects. "Keith," I said, "what is that?" He looked up from his phone, followed my gaze, and his expression went flat. Not scared exactly, more like resigned. "Probably kids," he said, "messing around." But we both knew no kids were hiking an hour into the woods to string up wire in a hollow that everyone in town avoided. I stood up and walked over to get a better look. Keith stayed where he was. The wire was thin, like fishing line but stronger. Professional grade, maybe. And hanging from it, spaced every 6 inches or so, were bones. Small bones, bird skulls, tiny vertebrae, what looked like a squirrel jaw. They'd been bleached white, and each one had a symbol drawn on it in black ink. Not burned or carved, drawn like someone had used a marker. The symbols weren't anything I recognized. Geometric shapes, mostly triangles inside circles, lines with dots, something that looked like a stick figure, but with too many limbs. "We should go," Keith said from behind me. His voice was different now, tight. I reached out to touch one of the bones, and Keith grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Don't," he said, "just don't touch it." We packed up faster than we'd unpacked. Keith didn't talk much on the hike back to the Jeep, and I didn't push him. But I kept thinking about how those bones had been bleached, how deliberate it all looked, how the wire had been strung at exactly eye level for someone walking through that part of the hollow. We got back to the Jeep around 3 in the afternoon. Keith drove us back to his rental house, and Jennifer took one look at his face and asked what happened. He said nothing happened, we just hiked, it was fine. But that night I heard them arguing in the next room. Couldn't make out the words, but Jennifer's tone was sharp and Keith's was defensive. The next morning, Keith announced he was going back out to the property to take down that wire. Jennifer told him it was a terrible idea. I stayed out of it, figured it was between them, but Keith looked at me and asked if I'd go with him. I should have said no, but the way he asked, like he couldn't do it alone, made me agree. We drove back out that Friday morning. Same Forest Service road, same overgrown trail. But when we got to the hollow, the clearing where Keith had set up his tarp shelter looked different. All his camping gear, the tarp, the folding chairs, the cooler had been moved, not scattered but rearranged. Everything was now stacked in a neat pile in the center of the clearing, and around the pile someone had arranged a circle of rocks. "What the fuck?" Keith said quietly. We stood at the edge of the clearing for maybe 30 seconds, neither of us moving. The woods were still that same muted quiet, no bird sounds, no wind. Then Keith walked over to the pile and started pulling his stuff apart, checking to see if anything was missing or damaged. I walked back toward where we'd seen the bone wire. It was gone. The trees were still there and I could see the small marks in the bark where the wire had been tied, but the wire itself and all the bones were gone. Just empty air between the trunks. "Keith," I called. He came over, looked at where I was pointing. His jaw tightened. "Let's get my gear and go," he said. We were loading the tarp into his backpack when I heard the sound. It came from the ridge line to our left, a voice, distant but clear, calling down into the hollow. It was my mother's voice. "Sweetheart, where are you?" My mother had been dead for 4 years. Cancer. I'd been with her when she passed. I knew her voice, and I knew with absolute certainty that what I was hearing was impossible. Keith heard it too. I could tell by the way he froze, the tarp half shoved into his pack. "We need to go right now," he whispered. The voice called again, closer this time. "I can't find you, baby. Where'd you go?" We didn't run exactly, but we moved fast. Keith left half his gear where it was, just grabbed what he could carry, and we were back on the trail toward the jeep in under a minute. Behind us, the voice kept calling. My mother's voice, asking where I was, saying she needed to find me, getting closer with each call, even though there was no way anyone could move that fast through the undergrowth. We hit the Forest Service road breathing hard, got in the jeep, and Keith drove. Didn't look back, didn't slow down until we were on the highway. Neither of us talked about it that day, but that night, after Jennifer had gone to bed, Keith told me he was selling the property. Already had a buyer lined up, some guy from Tennessee who didn't ask questions. The sale went through 3 weeks later. I asked Keith once if he ever found out who set up that bone wire. He said no. But then he mentioned that the property records showed the hollow had been owned by 6 different people in the last 30 years, and none of them kept it longer than a year. What I don't tell people is what I found in my suitcase when I got home to Richmond. Tucked into the inside pocket, where I definitely hadn't put it, was a strip of pale bark about 3 inches long. Someone had carved a symbol into it, the same stick figure with too many limbs I'd seen on those bones. I burned it in my fireplace that night and told myself that was the end of it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear my mother's voice calling from far away. And I know if I went looking for where the sound was coming from, I'd find something standing just outside my door, waiting to see if I'd open it. Story 3. The research station I was assigned to sat about 8 miles into the Cherokee National Forest, accessible only by a jeep trail that washed out half the year. I was 29, working on my Master.S in environmental science, and the grant I'd been awarded required 6 weeks of solo data collection on forest regeneration patterns. The station had been built in the 70s, 1 room, solar panels on the roof, a hand-pumped well, and a chemical toilet in an outhouse 30 feet from the main building. My advisor, Dr. Kowalski, had spent 2 summers there in the 80s and spoke fondly about the isolation, how it let you really focus on the work. He neglected to mention that the Forest Service had almost shut the station down in the 90s due to ongoing complications, whatever that meant. I arrived in early June. A ranger named Thomas Cavina helped me haul my gear in via ATV, made sure the solar panels were working, and gave me a satellite phone for emergencies. He was Cherokee, probably mid-50s, with deep-set eyes that didn't give much away. "You'll be all right out here?" he asked as he was getting ready to leave. "Yeah, of course," I said. "I grew up camping. This is luxury compared to a tent." Thomas looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Don't go into the laurel thickets after dark, and if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer them." I laughed, thought he was messing with me, but he didn't smile, just got on his ATV and drove back down the trail, and I was alone. The first week was exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, focused work. I'd hike out each morning to my study plots, collect data on seedling growth, soil samples, canopy cover measurements. Come back to the station around 4, cook dinner on the camp stove, read or work on my field notes until dark. The station had a battery-powered lantern, but I tried to conserve power, so I'd usually be in bed by 9, asleep by 10. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd always been comfortable alone. If anything, I found the silence restful. The change started around day 10. I woke up in the middle of the night, 2:30 according to my watch, to the sound of scratching. Rhythmic, persistent scratching coming from underneath the station floor. The building was raised about 2 feet off the ground on concrete blocks, so there was a crawl space underneath, plenty of room for animals. I'd already seen evidence of raccoons, opossums, maybe a fox. So I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the scratching, telling myself it was just wildlife and I should go back to sleep. But the sound was wrong, too deliberate, too patterned. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 pause, like something was testing the floorboards looking for a weak point. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the floor. The scratching stopped immediately, total silence. I waited maybe 5 minutes, didn't hear anything else, and eventually fell back asleep. The next night it happened again. Same time, 2:30 exactly, same scratching pattern. This time I didn't turn on the light, just listened. The sound moved across the floor, following the same path, from the northwest corner where my cot was positioned, toward the center of the room, then back. After 10 minutes it stopped. By the third night I'd convinced myself it was a raccoon with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I even mentioned it in my field notes, made a joke about it. But when I crawled under the station the next morning to look for tracks or scat, I didn't find anything. The dirt was undisturbed. No paw prints, no droppings, no evidence anything had been under there at all. That's when I should have called it in on the satellite phone. But I didn't want to look paranoid. Didn't want Dr. Kowalski to think I couldn't handle basic field work. On day 14, I came back from my study plots to find the station door standing open. I knew I'd locked it. I was meticulous about that, kept the key on a carabiner clipped to my belt loop. But the door was wide open, and my gear inside had been moved. Not ransacked, just rearranged. My sleeping bag was unzipped and spread out flat on the cot. My field notebooks were stacked in a neat pile on the table, aligned perfectly with the table's edge. The camp stove had been moved from the counter to the floor, positioned exactly in the center of the room. I stood in the doorway trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door. Maybe wind had blown it open and the wind had also, carefully rearranged my belongings. I checked everything, nothing was missing. The satellite phone was still in its case. My food stores were untouched. Everything was there, just moved. I didn't sleep well that night. Lay awake listening, waiting for the scratching. It didn't come. The silence was worse. The next afternoon I was at study plot 7, about a mile from the station, when I found the first piece of torn fabric. It was caught on a branch at chest height, a strip of blue material maybe 6 inches long. Looked like it had been ripped from someone's shirt or jacket. I almost walked past it, but something made me look closer. The fabric wasn't weathered. The edges were fresh, and there was more of it, another strip 10 feet away, then another. Like someone had walked through here recently, catching their clothing on the undergrowth, leaving a trail. I followed the fabric strips for maybe 50 yards. They led off my study plot, deeper into the forest, toward one of the laurel thickets Thomas had warned me about. Dense, almost impenetrable thickets of mountain laurel that grew in tangled masses where the sunlight couldn't reach. The last strip of fabric was tied deliberately to a low branch right at the edge of the thicket. Not caught, tied. A bow, like someone wanted to mark the spot. I stood there staring at it, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and walk back to the station. But I'm a scientist. I'm trained to investigate. So I pushed into the thicket, branches scraping my arms, and I made it maybe 15 feet before I saw the opening. There was a gap in the laurel, a space maybe 3 feet wide where the branches didn't grow. And in that gap, looking down, I could see a hole in the ground. Not a natural sinkhole, this had been dug. The edges were too straight, too uniform. It was about 4 feet across and I couldn't see the bottom. I knelt at the edge and shone my phone's flashlight down. The hole went deeper than my light reached, at least 10 or 12 feet, with dirt walls that had been smoothed, almost polished. And at the very edge of my light's reach, I saw movement. Something pale rising up through the gap, a bare shoulder streaked with dirt, an arm reaching toward the surface. I didn't process what I was seeing. I just moved, stumbled backward out of the thicket, branches tearing at my clothes, and I ran. Didn't stop running until I was back at the station with the door locked and my satellite phone in my hands. I called Thomas, told him something was wrong, I needed to get out. He said he'd be there first thing in the morning, couldn't make it up the trail in the dark, too dangerous, but he'd come at dawn. I sat in the station with my back against the door, the lantern on full brightness, listening to the woods outside. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, shuffling footsteps circling the building. Then a voice right outside the wall. "Help me." It was my voice, my exact voice, exhausted and desperate. "Please, I'm hurt. Please open the door." I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just sat there with my hand over my mouth, trying not to breathe too loud. The voice kept calling for maybe 20 minutes, always my voice, always begging to be let in. Sometimes it would change tactics. "It's safe now, you can come out," or "Thomas is here, open up." But always my voice. When it finally stopped, I heard the scratching under the floor again, louder this time, more insistent. And then I heard the boards beginning to crack. I grabbed everything I could carry, phone, wallet, water bottle, and I made a decision. I opened the door and I ran. Ran down the Jeep trail in the dark, tripping over ruts and rocks, not daring to use my flashlight because I didn't want to see if something was behind me. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 40 minutes, and I didn't stop until I saw headlights coming up the trail. Thomas found me sitting in the middle of the road, shaking. He didn't ask questions. Just put me in his truck and drove me out to the ranger station, where I spent the rest of the night in his office with the lights on. In the morning, I tried to explain what happened. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The last researcher who stayed at that station left after 3 weeks. Before that, someone made it 5 weeks. Before that, 10 days. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Would you have believed me?" Thomas went back to the station with 2 other rangers that afternoon to collect my gear. He said everything was there, exactly where I'd left it, except the floorboards in the center of the room had a hole in them now. Not a crack, a hole about 2 feet across, like something had pushed through from underneath. They sealed the station after that, permanently. As far as I know, it's still sitting there in the Cherokee National Forest, door locked, solar panels gathering dust, waiting for the next person who thinks isolation is peaceful. I finished my master's degree using data from someone else's research site. Never went back into those woods. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Knoxville, I hear scratching underneath my floor, and I know it's just old pipes or the building settling or the neighbors downstairs. I know that. But I also know that when I checked my field notebook after everything happened, there was an entry I didn't write. Just one line in handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't quite right. "Don't leave. We're not finished." Story 4. I was driving back from a wedding in Hot Springs, North Carolina, taking the back roads because I'd missed the turn for the highway and my GPS had decided to route me through what I can only describe as the most isolated stretch of mountain road I'd ever seen. This was late November, maybe 8 o'clock at night, and I'd been driving for about 90 minutes on roads that got progressively narrower and more poorly maintained. My name's Victor Kozlov. I'm an accountant from Charlotte. That detail seems important because accountants are supposed to be rational, practical people, and what happened that night contradicted every rational instinct I have. The road I was on, I think it was called Rattlesnake Pike or maybe Copper Ridge Road, had devolved from 2 lanes to barely 1, with heavy forest on both sides and no houses, no lights, nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness. My phone had lost service about 20 minutes ago. The GPS still worked, claimed I'd be back on a main road in another 40 minutes, but I was starting to doubt that. I rounded a curve and my headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I slowed down I realized it was a person, standing directly in the center of the road, facing away from me. I stopped the car maybe 30 feet away. The person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman from behind, didn't move. Just stood there, shoulders hunched, head tilted at an odd angle like they were looking up at the trees. I sat there with my foot on the brake, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I tapped my horn. Once, lightly. The person's head snapped around to look at me, and that's when I saw their face in my headlights. I only got a glimpse before they turned away again, pale skin, eyes that reflected the light wrong like an animal's. And then they were walking off the road into the trees on the left side, moving in this stiff, disjointed way that made my stomach clench. I should have just driven past, should have gotten out of there as fast as possible, but I made the mistake of glancing to my right, into the woods on the passenger side, and I saw more of them. Dozens of pale figures standing among the trees. not moving. Just standing there, all facing the road, all watching my car. I hit the gas. Didn't floor it because the road was too narrow and I was afraid of sliding into the ditch, but I accelerated as much as I dared. In my rearview mirror, I could see the figure that had been in the road standing at the edge where the pavement met the trees, watching me drive away. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I told myself I'd imagined it. Bad lighting, shadows playing tricks, maybe someone's weird art installation or a prank, but I'd seen their faces. I'd seen the way they stood, too still, too deliberate. I drove for another 10 minutes without seeing anything unusual. Started to relax a little. Turned on the radio to fill the silence, but all I got was static on every station. That's when I noticed the smell. It came through the air vents, thick and organic, like turned earth and rotting leaves and something else, something sweet and wrong. I closed the vents, but the smell got stronger. It filled the car until I could taste it in the back of my throat. Then I heard the sound on the roof, scratching, dragging, something moving across the top of my car. I was doing maybe 40 miles per hour on a narrow mountain road in the dark, and something was on my roof. I could hear it, not just the sound of it moving, but the car's suspension shifting slightly under its weight. I accelerated, 50, 55. The road curved and I almost missed the turn, tires skidding on loose gravel. The scratching continued, unfazed by the speed or the curve. Then I felt pressure on the windshield, like something was pressing down from above, testing the glass. A hand slid into view from the top of the windshield. Long fingers, too many joints, skin so pale it was almost translucent. The fingers spread across the glass, pressing, and I watched cracks begin to spiderweb from where it was pushing. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, fishtailed slightly, and I felt the weight on the roof shift forward. Whatever was up there lost its grip, and I heard it slide across the hood with a horrible scraping sound before it disappeared somewhere in front of the car. I didn't see it fall, didn't see where it went. I accelerated again before the car had fully stopped skidding. Drove for another 5 minutes, checking my rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, just empty road. My windshield had 3 long cracks running from the top edge down toward the dashboard. I could see them in the reflection of my headlights. The glass hadn't shattered, but it had been close. I made it back to main road around 9:30. Stopped at the first gas station I saw, one of those tiny places that's really just 2 pumps in a building barely bigger than a shed. An older man was working the counter. I went in, bought a coffee. I didn't want just to have an excuse to talk to someone. "Road's pretty empty back there," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked at me, then at my car through the window at the cracked windshield. "You came from Rattlesnake Pike?" he asked. "I think so. GPS routed me that way." He nodded slowly. "Most folks don't use that road at night anymore." "Why not?" He paused like he was deciding how much to say. Then, about 15 years back, there was a bus accident. Church group from Asheville, 23 people. Bus went off the side of the road in bad weather. Didn't find any survivors. I waited, but he didn't continue. "That's terrible," I finally said, "but what does that have to do with?" "They only recovered 18 bodies," he interrupted. "Never found the other 5. Mountain rescue looked for weeks. Just gone." I paid for my coffee and left. Drove straight back to Charlotte. Didn't stop except for gas. When I got home, I parked in my garage and sat in the car for a long time, staring at those cracks in the windshield. In the morning, I took the car to a glass repair shop. The technician looked at the cracks and asked what hit me. I said I didn't know, maybe a rock kicked up from the road. He gave me a skeptical look. "These cracks originate from sustained pressure," he said. "Like something was pushing on the glass from the outside, not an impact." I didn't argue, just paid for a new windshield and tried to forget about it. But last week, I was scrolling through news articles from Western North Carolina, and I found a story about Rattlesnake Pike. Another driver had reported seeing multiple individuals standing in the road late at night. She stopped to offer help and said they surrounded her car, pressing against the windows, and she'd had to drive through them to escape. The article quoted a sheriff's deputy saying they'd investigated but found no evidence of anyone in the area. The article included a photo of the woman's car. The windshield had long cracks running from the top edge down toward the dashboard. 3 cracks, exactly like mine had been. I don't drive back roads at night anymore. And when I have to drive that part of North Carolina for work, I take the highway, even if it adds an hour to the trip. Because I remember those figures in the trees, all of them standing perfectly still, all of them watching. And I remember that hand sliding across my windshield, those fingers with too many joints pressing down. What I don't tell anyone, what I haven't even fully processed myself, is that when I got home that night, I found something wedged in my windshield wiper. A small piece of fabric, pale blue, torn like it had been ripped from clothing. It wasn't mine, and it looked exactly like the kind of material you'd use for church clothing. The kind of thing you'd wear to Sunday service. I threw it away. But sometimes I wonder if those 5 missing bodies from the bus accident are still out there on Rattlesnake Pike, standing among the trees, waiting for headlights to appear on that lonely road. Story 5. A hunting cabin my grandfather built sat in a hollow off Caney Fork in Tennessee, about 3 hours northeast of Nashville. I'd been there maybe a dozen times as a kid, always during deer season, always with my grandfather and my cousin Isabella. After he died in 2018, the property passed to my father, who had no interest in hunting or maintaining a remote cabin, so it just sat there empty for 3 years. In October of 2021, I decided to spend a long weekend there. I was going through a difficult breakup, needed to get away from the city, and the cabin seemed like the right kind of isolation. Quiet, no cell service, nothing to do but read and maybe do some hiking. I'm a graphic designer. I work from home most of the time, so taking off for a few days wasn't complicated. I drove up on a Thursday afternoon. The road to the cabin was worse than I remembered, nearly washed out in places, and I almost turned back twice, but I made it. Parked my Outback next to the cabin and unloaded my gear. The place looked smaller than it had in my memories. 1 room, a loft where we used to sleep as kids, a stone fireplace that took up most of 1 wall. My grandfather had installed a composting toilet in a small addition off the back, and there was a hand pump for well water in the kitchen area. No electricity, no running water beyond what you pumped yourself. I set up my sleeping bag in the loft, got the fireplace going, and made dinner on a camp stove. Watched the sun go down through the front window. The hollow was beautiful in that early autumn way, leaves just starting to turn, everything golden and red in the late light. I slept well that first night. The kind of deep sleep you get when you're truly away from everything. Woke up Friday morning feeling more rested than I had in months. I spent the day hiking the property. My grandfather had owned about 60 acres, most of it steep hillside covered in hardwoods. There were old trails I remembered, though they were overgrown now. I found the tree stand my grandfather had built when I was 10, the wood gray and rotting. Found the creek where Isabella and I used to look for salamanders. Late in the afternoon, I found something I didn't remember. A stone foundation, maybe 10 feet square, in a flat area about half a mile from the cabin. Nothing was left but the stones arranged in a rectangle, with gaps where a door might have been. Moss covered everything. Young trees were growing up through the middle. I stood there trying to remember if my grandfather had ever mentioned another structure on the property. I didn't think so, but it had clearly been here a long time. The trees growing through it were at least 20 years old. When I got back to the cabin, I checked my grandfather's old maps. He'd kept detailed property surveys, and I found them in a metal box under the loft ladder. The maps showed the cabin, the creek, the property boundaries. They didn't show any other structures. I made dinner, read by lantern light, went to bed around 10. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of voices outside. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but I was awake, lying in my sleeping bag in the loft, and I could hear them clearly. Multiple voices speaking low, like people having a conversation they didn't want overheard. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of speech. I lay there listening, trying to orient myself. The voices were coming from outside, somewhere near the front of the cabin. They'd speak for a few seconds, then pause, then speak again. The cadence was odd, too fast, like the speakers were in a hurry, but also repetitive, like they were saying the same things over and over. I climbed down from the loft and went to the front window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the clearing around the cabin, but I didn't see anyone. The voices continued, clear as anything, but there was no one there. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the front door, shone the light around the clearing. Empty. The voices stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood on the porch for maybe 5 minutes listening. Nothing, just the normal night sounds of the forest, insects, a distant owl. I went back inside, locked the door, and climbed back up to the loft. The voices started again about 10 minutes later. Same rhythm, same hushed urgency. I tried to ignore them, told myself it was some acoustic trick of the hollow, sound carrying weird from the nearby road or from another cabin I didn't know about. But we were 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, and the sound was clearly coming from right outside. Eventually, I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. Saturday morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin looking for footprints or any sign someone had been there. Found nothing. The grass was damp with dew and would have shown tracks easily. There were none. I tried to shake off the unease. Made breakfast, read for a while, convinced myself I'd been half asleep, and imagined the voices or misinterpreted some natural sound. Around noon, I decided to go back to that stone foundation I'd found. Don't know why, curiosity, maybe, or just wanting to understand more about the property. I hiked out to the site, and when I got there I saw something I'd missed the day before. The stones at the southeast corner had been disturbed recently. Moved. You could see where they'd been pulled away from the foundation and set aside in a small pile. And beneath where those stones had been, there was a depression in the ground, like something had been digging. The depression was maybe 2 feet across and perhaps a foot deep. The soil looked fresh, dark and moist, and at the bottom of it, I could see the edge of something pale and rectangular. I knelt and brushed away some of the loose dirt. It was a tin box, maybe the size of a shoebox, with rust at the seams but still intact. Someone had dug it up, or partially dug it up, then covered it again. I pulled the box free and opened it. Inside were photographs. Old photographs, black and white, edges yellowed. I flipped through them quickly. They showed people, families, groups of men and women in old-fashioned clothing, kids, and they showed the stone foundation when it had been a complete building, a small cabin with a peaked roof. The last photograph in the stack showed the cabin at night. Dark windows, moonlight on the roof. And in the doorway, barely visible, were figures, 3 or 4 of them standing close together, their faces turned toward the camera. The image was blurry, overexposed, but I could make out their shapes. I don't know why I did it, but I took the tin box with me back to the cabin, set it on the table and sat there looking at the photographs, trying to understand what I was seeing. The building in the photos was definitely the foundation I'd found, same location, same size. But there was no record of it on my grandfather's maps, which meant either he didn't know about it or he deliberately left it off. That night the voices came back, louder this time, more urgent, and close, right outside the cabin door. I lay in the loft listening, and I realized something that made my mouth go dry. The voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. Just sounds, repetitive and insistent, like they were trying to communicate, but didn't have the words. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing from one side to the other, then back. The boards creaked under the weight. I climbed down from the loft and stood in the middle of the cabin, staring at the door. The footsteps continued, back and forth, back and forth. Then they stopped. The door handle turned. Slowly, testing, I'd locked it, but I watched the handle rotate as far as the lock would allow, then reverse, then rotate again. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The handle stopped moving. Silence. Then one of the voices spoke, and this time it was clear, right outside the door. "Give it back." Voice was wrong. Flat, emotionless, like someone was reading words they didn't understand. "Give what back?" I managed to ask. No answer. But the door began to rattle in its frame like someone was pushing against it. Not violently, just steady pressure testing the strength of the lock. I grabbed the tin box from the table and shoved it into my backpack. Didn't know what else to do with it, but I knew I wasn't leaving it there. The pressure on the door increased. I heard the wood beginning to crack. I went out the back, through the small addition where the composting toilet was, and I ran. Didn't take anything but my backpack and my car keys. Ran through the dark woods, tripping over roots and rocks, until I got to where I'd parked my car. The drive out was a blur. Didn't breathe normally until I was back on paved roads, with lights and houses and the ordinary world around me. I still have that tin box, kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, but I've never gone back to the cabin. My father listed the property for sale last year. It hasn't sold. The realtor said people lose interest after they visit it, said it has bad energy, which is real estate speak for something they can't quite explain. What I've never told anyone is that sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Nashville, I hear those voices. Faint, like they're coming from very far away but unmistakable. They're still asking for something, still wanting me to give it back. I don't know what was in that other cabin or who the people in those photographs were. But whatever they were guarding, whatever was buried under that foundation, I took it. and they know where I am. Story 6. I moved to Banner Elk, North Carolina in February 2020 for a job at the ski resort, thinking it would be temporary, one season to save money, then back to Raleigh. But the job turned into a year-round position, and by the time I realized I wanted to leave, I'd signed a lease on a small rental house about 10 minutes outside of town, up a gravel road that serviced maybe 6 or 7 properties scattered across the mountainside. My closest neighbor, Alana Mitchell, lived about a quarter-mile down the slope. I'd met her once briefly when I first moved in. She was probably in her 70s, kept to herself, had a dozen or so chickens that free-ranged on her property. We'd wave if we saw each other on the road, but that was about it. The isolation didn't bother me until the winter of 2021. Heavy snows that year, and my road didn't get plowed regularly, which meant I was stuck at the house for days at a time when storms came through. That's when I started noticing the tracks. They'd appear overnight in the fresh snow, not animal tracks. I grew up hunting, knew what deer and bear and coyote prints looked like. These were footprints, barefoot human prints, heading up from the woods below my house, crossing my driveway, then disappearing into the trees on the other side. The first time I saw them, I figured it was a kid from one of the other properties messing around. But the prints were too large, adult-sized, maybe a men's 10 or 11. And the stride was long, longer than normal, like whoever made them had been running or leaping. I followed them once, down into the woods toward Alana's property, but they vanished at the tree line where the snow had been blown clear by wind. I mentioned them to Alana the next time I saw her, casual-like, asked if she'd noticed anything strange. She got very still when I asked. Then she said, "You see tracks in the snow, you leave them alone. Don't follow them. Don't try to figure out where they go." "Why?" I asked. "Because some things don't want to be found," she said, and went back into her house. The tracks kept appearing. Every time it snowed, they'd be in the morning. Always the same pattern up from the woods, across my driveway into the trees on the other side. I tried to catch whoever it was, set up a trail camera facing the driveway, checked it every morning. The camera recorded nothing. Just empty snow, no movement, no person, but the tracks would be there anyway. In March, the snow finally melted for good and the tracks stopped. I figured that was the end of it, but then I started hearing the tapping. It would start around midnight. Tap, tap, tap on my bedroom window. Rhythmic, persistent. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. I'd get up and look out the window, nothing. Just darkness and the trees moving in the wind. I thought maybe it was a branch, but I checked during the day and there were no branches close enough to touch the glass. I trimmed back the ones that were even remotely near, just to be sure. The tapping continued. One night in April, I was lying awake listening to the tapping when I decided I'd had enough. I got out of bed, pulled on jeans and a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and went outside to see what was causing it. The tapping stopped the moment I opened the door. I walked around to the side of the house, where my bedroom window was, shone my flashlight on the glass and the ground beneath it. Nothing. No marks on the window, no footprints in the soft dirt below, but standing there in the dark, I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct told me to go back inside. I turned to head back to the door, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 40 feet away. Tall, at least 7 feet, and pale, its skin almost luminescent in the dark. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its arms hanging at its sides, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I knew it was looking at me. I didn't run, couldn't run. I was frozen, flashlight pointing uselessly at the ground, my breath coming in short gasps. We stood there looking at each other. If it had eyes to look with, I couldn't tell, for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then it took a step toward me, not fast, but deliberate. One long step that covered more ground than should have been possible. That broke the paralysis. I turned and ran for the door, fumbled with the handle, got inside and locked it. Stood with my back against the door, heart slamming in my chest, waiting to hear footsteps on the porch or tapping on another window. Nothing, complete silence. I didn't sleep that night. Sat on my couch with every light in the house on, holding a kitchen knife because I didn't own a gun. At dawn, I went to Alana's house and knocked until she answered. "I saw something," I told her, "last night by the trees, tall and pale and—" "I know," she said quietly, "I've seen it too." She let me in, made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table while she explained. She'd lived on the mountain for 43 years. Her husband had bought the property in the 70s, built their house himself, and they'd raised 2 kids there. Her husband died in 2003, kids moved away, but Alana stayed. She loved the mountain, loved the isolation. About 10 years ago, she started seeing the same thing I'd seen. Usually at night, always at the edge of the trees, just watching. At first she thought it was a person, maybe someone lost or hurt, and she'd call out to it. But it never responded, never came closer unless she went toward it. Once, she said, I tried to get a better look, took my flashlight and walked toward it. The closer I got, the more wrong it looked. Its proportions weren't right, limbs too long, head too small, and its skin wasn't pale like a person's. It was pale like something that had never seen sunlight, like something that shouldn't be above ground. Did it ever do anything, I asked, besides watch? She hesitated, then it tried to get inside, tested the doors, the windows. I'd hear it moving around the house at night, trying to find a way in. This went on for months. I almost sold the property because of it. What stopped you? It lost interest, she said. I don't know why. One day it just stopped coming around. I'd still see it sometimes out in the woods, but it didn't approach the house anymore. What do you think it is? I asked. I don't know, Alana said, but I think it lives underground. There are old mine shafts all through these mountains, most of them unmapped. Places that go deep, where the dark is absolute. I think it comes up sometimes. I think it watches us. And I think if you let it, it'll try to get close. I gave notice on my lease that same day. Told the landlord I had a family emergency, needed to break the lease early. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay there. The last 2 weeks in that house were the longest of my life. I kept every light on, slept in the living room because I couldn't stand being in the bedroom with that window. The tapping continued every night, but I never looked, never went outside. The night before I left, I heard something new. Scratching at the back door, low down near the ground, like something was trying to dig underneath it. I sat on the couch listening to that sound for hours, knife in my hand, until the sun came up. When I went outside in the morning to load my car, I found marks in the dirt beneath the back door. Long scratches, 5 of them, like claw marks, but the spacing was wrong, too wide, like whatever made them had a hand much larger than human. I drove away from that house and I've never been back. Moved to Charlotte, got a job in an office, live in an apartment complex where there are people all around me all the time. The isolation I used to crave now terrifies me. Sometimes I look up Alana's address on Google Maps, just to see if she's still there. The satellite image shows her house, still standing, chickens in the yard. I've thought about calling her, checking if she's all right, but I don't have her number. And part of me doesn't want to know if something's changed. If it came back, what I've never told anyone is what I found when I was packing. In the back of my closet, shoved into the corner, was a piece of paper. I didn't put it there. It was folded into a small square, and when I opened it, there was a drawing. It was crude, done in pencil, but I could make out what it was meant to be. A figure tall, thin, with limbs too long, standing outside a house. And inside the house, visible through a window, was another figure. Smaller, human-shaped. Below the drawing, in handwriting that looked like a child's, was a single word: soon. I burned that paper in my sink before I left, but I remember it clearly. I remember every line of that drawing. And sometimes, late at night in my Charlotte apartment, I hear tapping on my window. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. I never look to see what's making the sound. I'm afraid of what I might see standing there, 6 floors up, where nothing should be able to reach. Story 7. The logging road I took that morning in May 2022 was one I'd driven 100 times. It cut through national forest land, about 20 miles south of Asheville, connecting a handful of trailheads that hikers used to access the backcountry. I wasn't hiking that day. I was a photographer, working on a project documenting old-growth forests, and I'd gotten permission from the Forest Service to access some restricted areas. I was 41, divorced for 3 years, living alone and mostly okay with it. Photography had become my escape, my focus. I'd sold a few pieces to magazines, had a modest following on Instagram. Nothing that paid the bills, but enough to feel like I was building towards something. The road was rough, more rocks than gravel, and I was driving slow in my Jeep Grand Cherokee, watching for the marker that would indicate where I needed to turn off. GPS was useless out here, no signal, and the map I'd been given by the ranger, Eric Larson, was hand-drawn and not particularly detailed. I found the turnoff around 9 in the morning. parked where the road became impassable, grabbed my camera gear and backpack, and started hiking. The area I was photographing was supposedly never logged, which was rare for this part of the Blue Ridge. Trees here were ancient, massive tulip poplars, oaks with trunks 5 feet across, hemlocks that blocked out most of the sunlight. The understory was sparse, just ferns and moss, and walking through it felt like being in a cathedral. Everything was quiet except for my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I shot for about 2 hours, working my way deeper into the forest, following a rough trail that was probably made by deer. Got some good images, light filtering through the canopy, the texture of old bark, fungus growing on fallen logs. I was in that zone photographers get into, where you're seeing everything in terms of composition and light, and you forget about time. Around 11 I came to a clearing. Not a natural clearing, this was deliberate. The trees had been cut down, but not recently. The stumps were old, gray and rotting, and young trees were growing up through the open space. In the center of the clearing was a structure. It wasn't a cabin or a shed. It was more like a platform, built from rough-hewn logs, raised about 3 feet off the ground, maybe 15 feet square. The logs were weathered and split, and the whole structure leaned slightly to one side, but it was intact. I approached carefully, camera in hand, photographing as I went. When I got close enough, I saw that the platform had markings on it, carved into the wood, deep gouges that formed patterns. Not random, deliberate. Geometric shapes, mostly, but also what looked like handprints. Dozens of them, all different sizes, pressed into the logs like they'd been made when the wood was still soft. I climbed onto the platform to get a better look. The boards creaked but held my weight. In the center was a depression, maybe 2 feet across, where the boards had rotted away or been removed. Looking down through it, I could see the ground below and something else. There was a hole under the platform, not deep, maybe 3 feet, but it had been deliberately dug, the sides smooth and uniform. And at the bottom of the hole were objects. I took out my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. There were bones, animal bones I thought, though I wasn't sure, and pieces of fabric, and something that looked like rope or cord. Everything was old, half buried in the dirt at the bottom of the hole. I was so focused on photographing the hole that I didn't notice the smell at first. But once I did, I couldn't ignore it. Decay, but not the normal decay of the forest. This was sharper, more pungent, like something had died very recently and was starting to rot. I looked around the clearing, trying to locate the source. Didn't see anything. The smell seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I heard the breathing. It was close, maybe 10 or 15 feet away, coming from the tree line. Slow, labored breathing, like someone who'd been running and was trying to catch their breath. I turned toward the sound, camera still in my hand, and I waited for someone to emerge from the trees. Nothing, just that breathing, rhythmic and wet. "Hello?" I called out. The breathing stopped, total silence. I stood on that platform for maybe 30 seconds, frozen, waiting. Then I heard movement in the trees, not footsteps, something else. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. I got off the platform and started backing toward the trail I'd come from, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The dragging sound continued, moving parallel to me, staying just out of sight in the thick undergrowth. I didn't run. Every instinct told me that running would be a mistake, that whatever was making that sound would chase me if I ran. So I walked fast but controlled, back the way I'd come. The dragging sound followed me for maybe 100 yards. Then it stopped. I kept walking, didn't look back, didn't stop until I could see my Jeep through the trees. I threw my gear in the back and got behind the wheel, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Started the engine and drove out of there, faster than I should have on that rough road, not caring if I damaged the suspension. I was back on paved highway before I allowed myself to think about what had happened, or rather, what I'd heard, because I hadn't actually seen anything. Just heard breathing and dragging, and felt absolutely certain that something had been watching me from those trees. When I got home, I uploaded the photos from my camera, went through them one by one, looking at the clearing and the platform and the hole underneath. Everything looked normal in the images. Empty clearing, old wooden platform, nothing unusual, except in one photo. I'd taken a shot of the tree line while standing on the platform, just a quick grab to capture the context of where the structure was located. And in that photo, barely visible in the shadows between 2 large oaks, was a shape. I zoomed in, enhanced the image as much as I could without losing all definition. There was something there, Pale and hunched, partially obscured by the trees. I couldn't make out details, the resolution wasn't high enough, but I could see enough to know it was large, much larger than a person, and it had been watching me. I deleted that photo. Didn't even think about it, just selected it and hit delete. Then I went through the rest of the images from that day and deleted every single one. I called the ranger station the next day and told Eric Larson I wouldn't be continuing the project. He asked why, said I seemed enthusiastic about it. I made up something about a schedule conflict, thanked him for the opportunity. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You went to the clearing, didn't you?" "What clearing?" I asked. "You found the platform," he said. "I should have warned you, that area's not, people don't go there anymore, not since the 80s. "Why, what happened in the 80s? "Group of hunters," Eric said. "They set up camp near that clearing, 3 of them. Only 2 came back, and they wouldn't talk about what happened to the 3rd. Said he disappeared in the night. Search and rescue went out, spent a week looking, never found any trace of him." "And the platform?" I asked. "No one knows who built it or why," Eric said. "It was already there when this area became national forest land in the 50s. Old-timers claimed it was some kind of offering place. Said the original settlers built it to keep something appeased." "Keep what appeased?" Eric didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "I don't know, but every ranger who's worked this district has a story about that area. Strange sounds, things moving in the trees, people feeling watched. We don't publicize it because we don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention, but we also don't recommend anyone go there alone." I thanked him and hung up. Haven't been back to that part of the forest. Haven't done any more photography projects in remote areas. Mostly I shoot urban landscapes now, buildings and streets where there are people around all the time. But I still think about that photo, the one I deleted. I remember zooming in on that pale shape between the trees, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And I remember noticing one detail that I've tried to forget but can't. The shape had been holding something long and dark that might have been a branch or a piece of wood. Or might have been something else entirely. Last week I got a message on Instagram from an account I didn't recognize. No profile picture, no posts, username just a random string of numbers and letters. The message was a photo attachment. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won out. It was my photo, the one I'd deleted. The clearing, the tree line, that pale shape in the shadows. Except this version was clearer somehow, like someone had enhanced it with better software than I had access to. I could see more details now. The shape wasn't hunched. It was crouched, like something getting ready to move. And what it was holding wasn't a branch. It was a camera, my camera. The same model I'd been using that day, distinctive orange strap visible even in the shadows. But I'd left the clearing with my camera. I had it with me. I checked after I got that message. It's sitting on my desk right now, same orange strap, same everything. Which means whatever was in those trees had found another camera. Probably a camera that belonged to someone who went to that clearing before me. Someone who maybe didn't make it back out. I blocked that Instagram account immediately, tried to report it, but when I went to check if the report went through, the account was already gone, like it had never existed. I don't know what's in those woods south of Asheville, don't know what the platform was for or what those handprints mean. But I know I heard something breathing in the shadows, something too large to be human, and I know that whatever it was, it's still there, still watching that clearing, still waiting for someone to find that platform and wonder what it means. I moved to Atlanta last month, got a job doing corporate photography, boring stuff, office buildings and headshots. It's safe, predictable. I don't miss the mountains, don't miss the forests. Don't miss the isolation that used to feel like freedom and now feels like exposure. Sometimes late at night I get messages on Instagram from accounts with no profile pictures. I don't open them anymore, I just block and delete. But I see the notification before it goes away, and I can see the thumbnail of the attached image. It's always the same photo. The clearing, the platform, the trees, and every time, that pale shape is a little bit closer to the camera. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more supernatural tales from the Blue Ridge Mountains and beyond. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and if you've had your own strange experiences in Appalachia, I'd love to hear about them. Until next time, stay safe out there, and maybe think twice before taking that remote mountain road alone.